Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to the King's Crypt. Today, we're going to be deep diving into some truly spine tingling stories from Reddit. People think I'm blind, but the truth is, I'm too scared to open my eyes. Written by Roos85 of r/no sleep. I think today might be the day we get you to open your eyes. I haven't opened my eyes in 10 years. My therapist calls it optophobia, a fear of opening one's eyes. It all started in my teens when I witnessed the gruesome murder of my parents. My life was no different than a blind person. The only difference is that they have no choice in the matter. But I had to adapt to life as if I was blind. I used a blind stick to get around. I can tell the difference between different coins just by how they sound. I've learned to read Braille, but when people find out I'm not blind, they either think I'm crazy or that it's a joke. It's hard to describe the constant feeling of being scared. I live in a perpetual state of terror. It's like closing your eyes to the scary parts of a horror story. But for me, I kept them closed. I've seen many therapists over the years. Some have gotten close to helping me overcome my fear. But there is one major obstacle. I've been attending a support group for the past 5 years, and throughout those years, people would come and go. Normally, to overcome your fear, you need to face what it is that you're scared of. The success rate for this is high, but how can I face my fear if I'm too scared to open my eyes long enough to face it? I always found my therapist's voice so soothing, and always wondered if the voice matched his face. I think today you need to explain to me what happened to your parents. I could feel the bile rise in my stomach, and my hands began to clam up. I've never fully opened up about what happened all those years ago. It was my birthday, and my mom had just finished cutting the cake. I'm not sure where it came from or how it got in the house. I watched as it crept up behind my parents. It moved slowly, but with murderous intent. A bit like how a lion stalks its prey before it. What did the creature look like? He asked. It's like I have a picture of the creature seared into my brain. I can still see, even with my eyes closed. His eyes were bright red and filled with murderous hunger, I explained. My hands were shaking, and I could feel beads of sweat rolling down my back. Take your time. I promise you, you're perfectly safe, my therapist said in a soft, caring tone. It was frothing from the mouth, and he had teeth and claws that looked like they could rip you apart. The sound of my therapist's voice had changed to a more concerning tone. Are you sure it wasn't a man? Or an animal? He asked. It wasn't a man. It was some kind of beast. People don't move the way that creature moved. And when it was done with my parents, it started to move towards me. I was struck with paralyzing fear and couldn't do anything but close my eyes. I wasn't sure how long I was sitting there, but the police eventually came and I had to open my eyes. I could hear the glide of my therapist's pen as he made notes. I believe your phobia is your brain's response to the trauma of what you witnessed. It's protecting you from having to relive it. Kids process memories differently from adults. And in your case, you saw the murderer as some kind of monster. I could feel a warming sense of calm rise up in my feet, flooding my brain. I promise you're in a safe environment. There's no killer or creature in this room, said my therapist in a reassuring tone. I could feel my heart pound as I slowly began to open my eyes. My therapist had kept the room dark to protect my eyes. The sensation was probably what a blind person would experience when seeing the world for the first time. My eyes stung as they adjusted to what light was in the room. It took a few moments for my eyes to come into focus before I could see my therapist's soft, reassuring eyes. I always felt that that creature had killed my parents. It was always close, waiting for me to open the eyes. I could watch as it ripped me apart. The fear was still there, but the room was empty apart from me and the therapist. See? I told you there was nothing to be scared of. I was about to rejoice in my newfound sense of sight when I stepped dead in my tracks by the sound of a growling coming from behind my therapist. A sound I had only heard once, the night my parents were murdered. A feeling of intense dread overwhelmed me as I watched the same creature I was confronted with all those years ago creep up behind my therapist. It had the same red, hungry eyes as before, and pounced before I had a chance to warn him. My therapist screamed in the same agonizing pain my parents made as he was ripped apart in front of me. When it was done, it trained its sights on me, and before it could get to me, I shut my eyes again. You see, it was never the fear of opening my eyes. It was the fear of what would happen if I ever did. A Night at My Friend's House by dorimarcosta of r/no sleep. I was at my friend's house, a typical suburban residence surrounded by trees that whispered with the night wind. It was a night like any other, but a subtle unease kept me awake. As I tossed and turned in bed, I felt my throat dry and decided that I needed water. The house was steeped in silence, except for the soft snoring of my friend who slept soundly in the next room. I crept downstairs, trying not to make noise. The wooden floor creaked underneath my feet, and the darkness seemed to press down on me as I approached the kitchen. The faint moonlight partially lit the hallway, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. A sense of discomfort grew inside of me, but I ignored it, attributing it to the interrupted sleep. I opened the fridge, feeling the cold light envelop me. I grabbed a pitcher of water and drank directly from it, hearing only the sound of the liquid going down my throat. I closed the fridge, and that's when I heard a faint click coming from the direction of the living room. I stopped, listening carefully, and realized someone was fiddling with the front door. Curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I approached the hallway that led to the front entrance. The silhouette of a woman stood out against the door, and my heart raced as I recognized the figure as my friend's mother. She had her back to me, focused on carefully locking the door as if not trying to be heard. Shock froze me in place. I knew my friend's mother was out of town. He had told me that earlier today. I started to back away, but the wood creaked under my weight, and she turned abruptly. Our eyes met for a brief moment, but something was wrong with her. Her eyes were empty, lifeless, as if she didn't really see me. She began shuffling towards me with a slow, dragging gait, as if being pulled by some invisible string. The air around me seemed to grow colder with each step she took. My legs trembled, but I managed to turn and run back to my friend's room. The door slammed shut behind me, and I shook my friend awake with all the strength I could muster. He woke up confused, rubbing his eyes. "What is it?" he mumbled, still groggy. I quickly told him what I had seen, trying not to sound crazy. When I mentioned his mother, he froze, his face instantly paling. "My mom isn't here. She's miles away, visiting my aunt," he said, his voice trembling. The fear in his voice made me realize something was terribly wrong. He quickly got up and locked the bedroom door, placing a chair against it for reinforcement. We stayed silent, ears straining for any sound coming from the hallway. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by our own heavy breathing. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The air in the room became oppressive, as if we were being watched. Finally, we heard soft footsteps in the hallway, slowly shuffling towards the door. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. My friend grabbed his phone and started dialing frantically, but there was no signal. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Suddenly, the doorknob began to turn slowly, accompanied by a soft scratching on the wood. "Don't open it," I whispered, gripping my friend's arm. He nodded, his eyes wide with fear. The door trembled as if someone was gently pushing, testing the chair's resistance. Then, everything stopped. The silence returned, but it was different now, denser, more threatening. The door didn't move anymore, and the sound of footsteps retreated, echoing down the hallway. We were paralyzed, unsure if we should feel relieved or even more terrified. Time seemed to have stopped, each second stretching into an eternity of dread. My friend finally broke the silence. "This can't be happening," he whispered, as if trying to convince himself. But the truth was clear. Something was very wrong with this house. We decided we couldn't stay there any longer. We needed to leave, but the thought of facing whatever was out there was terrifying. We gathered our courage and decided to escape through the bedroom window. With difficulty, we opened the window and crawled out. The cold night air wrapped around us as we dropped onto the wet grass. We crouched for a moment, trying to listen for any signs of being followed. Everything was quiet, but the stillness only deepened our fear. We started running across the yard, heading for the streets. The trees around us seemed taller and more menacing under the moonlight. When we reached the gate, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed behind us. We looked back and saw my friend's mother standing at the edge of the garden, watching us with those empty eyes. She didn't move, but something in her gaze made us speed up. We ran like never before, with the sound of our hearts pounding in our ears. We reached a deserted street and kept running until the house was far behind. Finally, we stopped, panting and cold with sweat, trying to process what had just happened. We hid in a nearby playground, where we sat on a bench in shock. The silence of the night seemed to mock us. We tried calling my friend's parents again, but the phone still had no signal. Something was isolating us, trapping us in that endless night of terror. Time passed slowly, and the sky began to lighten with the first rays of sun. We felt a momentary relief, as if light could dispel whatever that evil presence was. When we returned to the house, we found the front door ajar, gently swinging in the morning breeze. My friend went in first, cautiously, and I followed. The house seemed normal, almost welcoming under the daylight, but the discomfort was still there, a shadow hanging over us. There was no sign of his mother, and everything was in its place as if nothing had happened. We decided to pack our things and leave immediately. While my friend was grabbing his clothes in the bedroom, I went to the kitchen. The water pitcher was exactly where I left it, but next to it was a note. The words, scribbled fastly on the paper, read, "She always comes back when night falls." The note fell from my hand, and I ran back to the bedroom. My friend was standing at the door, staring fixedly at something on the floor. I followed his gaze and saw a red stain that hadn't been there before, slowly spreading across the carpet. We didn't need to say anything. We knew it was no longer safe to stay here for another minute. We ran out, leaving everything behind. When we reached the street, one last look at the house revealed something that made my blood run cold. In the bedroom window, my friend's mother was standing, watching us with a sinister smile on her face. She slowly raised her hand and waved before disappearing into the darkness inside. That was the last time I saw my friend. He moved away with his father to another city. We never talked about that night again. But to this day, when night falls and the house is quiet, I remember that smile, and I can't help but think that somewhere she is still waiting for us in the dark. Our town received an EAS alert, and nothing about it makes sense. By notadog_1010 of r/no sleep. Hello, Reddit. It's currently 4 a.m. as I'm writing this, and nothing about the situation I'm in has changed for the better. There has been no new updates from local authorities, and I'm starting to doubt if this whole ordeal will end anytime soon. I suppose that I'll make this quick before something happens to me, for the better or worse. For some context, I live in a town situated in a sparsely populated area in Washington state. It's not a very big town, but it isn't a small one either. The whole thing began about 6 hours ago, while I was hanging out with some friends at my friend Caesar's house. We were in the middle of a very dramatic game of Uno, when all of a sudden this message flashed on the television screen, accompanied by the familiar sound of the EAS alarm. Emergency Alert System. The following message is transmitted at the request of the United States Department of Defense. A civil emergency warning is issued for the following counties. All residents living in the aforementioned counties are advised to stay indoors due to unprecedented threats. Lock all entrances into your home, turn off all lights, and do not let anybody into your home under any circumstances. Emergency services will not be available until 8/11/2024 at 0800 hours, effective until all clear is given. We were all too stunned to speak. A ton of questions raced through my mind, but I couldn't come up with any feasible explanation. And judging from the expressions on my friend's face, neither could they. For a few moments, nobody said a word, till my friend Michaela broke the silence by saying, "Well, that's certainly something." "Well, guess you guys are stuck here with me now," said Caesar, as he opened a can of Coca-Cola that he had just got from the fridge. "Fuck, man, I ain't staying here with you guys," groaned Adrian as he slumped back into his chair, his gaze drifting to the cards in his hands. Too bad, Michaela chuckled. You're going to have to stay here with us. Whatever, Adrian replied. He placed down a yellow card, adding to the steadily growing pile of cards in the center of the table. At that moment, the droning sound of a low-flying helicopter grabbed our attention. We sprang from our chairs and headed to the living room windows, where we watched as the silhouette of the helicopter passed overhead. It was hard to tell, especially at night, but we could see the number 58 painted on the side of the helicopter, indicating to us that it was most likely a military aircraft. A beam of light emanating from the copter's underside briefly illuminated the near-empty street and the surrounding houses, before the aircraft flew off and disappeared into the night sky. What really caught our attention were the military vehicles that came just as the helicopter flew over. Humvees, APCs, and military trucks drove past the house, some of which were briefly illuminated as they passed underneath the helicopter's powerful searchlight. Strangely, though, they were all painted white instead of typical green or light brown usually seen on military vehicles. Other than that, none of them bore any insignia or indication as to where they were from. Most strange of all, however, were the black SUVs that followed just behind them. I counted maybe 5 or 6 of them, but it was hard to tell, especially given how fast they were driving. These didn't seem to be undercover cops, but I'd seen enough movies and television shows to safely assume that they were probably the FBI or some other government agency. The vehicle sped off into the distance, going into the direction of the nearby fire station. Dang, that must be the National Guard, Michaela said, in awe of what she just witnessed. They seem to be looking for something, Monica noted. Or someone, I added. An escaped fugitive, maybe? But that's the whole fucking military, Caesar rejected. Unless it's like a terrorist or something. At that moment, 3 more vehicles drove past, and I was able to take a quick glance at them. 2 of them were once again black SUVs, but the third one seemed to be some sort of van. Although I couldn't take a good look at them before they made it down the road. Beats me, Kate replied. So you guys want to keep playing Uno? Nah, I think I'm good, said Monica. Though the atmosphere amongst us was still somewhat jovial, there was a hint of worry and nervousness. Maybe we should, do what the alert told us to do, Isabel spoke up. We all agreed with her, and after all, if there was an armed man on the loose, it would probably be smart to do what the authorities advised us to do. So Caesar and I locked all the doors and windows and turned off all the lights except for the one in the basement, which is where we decided to stay for the meantime. We continued our game of Uno, but by that point the shock and worry that we had all received from the alert had spoiled much of the thrill and excitement that was present before. Eventually, we grew bored and decided that we should probably hit the sack now, since we didn't really have a choice. Caesar got out some spare mattresses and pillows and handed them to each of us. I went upstairs to sleep in one of the bedrooms along with Caesar and Monica, while the rest stayed in the basement. I laid down on my mattress and began scrolling through YouTube and Reddit on my phone, until I inevitably grew tired and fell asleep. Sometime later, I awoke to the sound of creaking and footsteps coming from the backyard, right outside the room I was sleeping in. I initially assumed that the noises were a raccoon or something, scurrying across the yard. But as I listened carefully, I realized that the footsteps sounded more human, and they almost sounded like someone was limping or stumbling around. Getting up, I crept towards the partially open window and slowly opened the blinds, squinting to see in the dark. I surveyed the area through the open blinds. The backyard was bathed in a faint moonlight. To the right was a small shed, but other than that, it was mostly empty. I sighed in relief, thinking that it indeed had been some sort of wild animal, and was about to close the blinds and go right back to sleep, which is why I nearly jumped when I saw her. I somehow hadn't noticed her before, but beside the shed there appeared to be a silhouette of a young girl. She seemed to have long hair and was in a crouched position, but those were the only details that I could ascertain. I had to do a double take to make sure that I was seeing things correctly, but indeed, there was a fucking girl in the backyard. Dude, I thought you were asleep, a tired voice spoke from behind me. Jesus Christ, Caesar, don't scare me like that. I wasn't trying to, said Caesar as he rubbed his eyes. What are you doing? Caesar, did you lock the back gate after I told you to do so earlier? Fuck, I forgot. Why, what about it? Said Caesar. Just come over here, I told him, my gaze still transfixed on the young girl. She still hadn't moved from her original spot. Caesar came to the window, and I pointed to where the young girl was, and as expected, he was startled to see her there. What the fuck, dude? How'd she get there? Beats me, I responded. Through the gate, probably. As we both stood there looking through the window, the sound of a vehicle pulling up out front caught our attention. Carefully, we made our way to the living room. and peeked through the blinds. Outside, a black SUV similar to the ones from before was parked in front of the house. Its powerful headlights illuminated the front yard, though the window blinds only permitted a thin shaft of light to stream into the living room. 4 people got out of the car, 3 men and a woman. They all seemed to be wearing military-style gear and were carrying assault rifles, but one of the men, a tall and bulky Hispanic-looking dude, was carrying some sort of device that we couldn't see clearly. We could also see from small patches on their shoulders that read something like SIRS, or something like that. Careful not to alert them of our presence, Caesar and I intently listened in on their conversation. "She should be around here somewhere," the Hispanic dude said. "You sure, Garcia?" one of the men asked. This one was slightly shorter and of average build. "I don't fucking trust this one bit." "Come on, O'Connor," replied the other man, who was slimmer but roughly the same height. "We've dealt with her before." "What's gonna make this any different?" "I don't fucking know," retorted O'Connor. "Probably because she killed like 20 of our guys back in Almota." "More than that, actually," the woman added. She was blonde and had a ponytail that was slightly shorter than the others. "Are they looking for the girl?" Caesar nudged me. "Probably," I replied. "Fuck, man, she's literally in our backyard." "And by the sounds of it, things aren't going to be pretty," added Caesar. We both shuddered at the thought of what could possibly happen once they find her. We watched as the 4 split into 2 groups. Garcia and O'Connor headed down the footpath alongside of the house, while the other 2 headed in the opposite direction and rounded the other side. Me and Caesar quickly headed back to our room, by which point Monica and Isabel had been aroused from their slumber. "The fuck are you guys doing?" a half-asleep Monica asked. "Dude, there's people outside of our fucking house," Caesar replied in a hushed tone. "They've got guns. They're going around the back." "What?" Isabella looked at us inquisitively as she let out a yawn. Suddenly, we heard something outside being knocked over, followed by rapid footsteps. The 4 of us were drawn to the window, through which we watched as Garcia and O'Connor walked through the fence to the back of the backyard, guns raised and ready. As Garcia swept his rifle across the yard, the flashlight at the end of the barrel briefly illuminated the shed, and for a moment we were able to see the young girl in full. She appeared to be no older than 13 or 14, and was wearing a dark green dress of some sort. There was a 3-digit number tattooed on the side of her neck, though I could only make out the first 2 digits as 00, while the 3rd digit was either a 5 or maybe a 6. As the light was trained on her, she could be seen covering her face with her arms. "She's right there! She is right there!" Garcia yelled, having evidently spotted her. "Scorpion, HQ, we've sighted the target." To the girl, he shouted, "Don't you fucking—" All of a sudden, we heard a loud pop, prompting us to duck for cover. However, I was the only person who remained standing long enough to see Garcia fall to the ground. His head was gone, and what remained of his neck was now a gaping hole. Chunks of flesh were strewn across the yard, and dark red blood splattered everywhere. The girl was still crouched, but she was no longer covering her face. In fact, it looked as if she was grinning, almost ear to ear, with a sinister, soul-sucking smile. She made a sweeping motion with her left arm, and for a brief moment I could have sworn her hand glowed blue, or purple maybe. What followed was a deafening cacophony of automatic gunfire that shattered the quiet yet tense atmosphere of the neighborhood. I dropped onto my stomach below the windowsill and covered my ears. Isabel hastily crawled underneath her mattress, while Caesar and Monica were huddled together on the floor as the sound of gunshots rang. Though I was covering my ears, I could faintly hear O'Connor yelling something to the effect of, "Subject is engaging us! Request for backup!" before he suddenly let out a terrifying scream that seemed to literally go over the house. His screams were quickly silenced, and a few moments later we could hear what sounded like heavy objects falling onto the roof. The gunfire briefly ceased. We all rose from cover, shaken to the core by what had just transpired. We tried to peek through the window to see what was happening, but at that point, Adrian burst into the room yelling, "What the fuck is happening?" At that moment, more gunshots rang through the air. We sprang from the room as bullets passed through the window, but as we did, we heard what sounded like women yelling outside. Before a loud crash rocked the house, Caesar went into the kitchen to investigate, while the rest of us sprinted into the basement, where Michaela and Kate were similarly confused and terrified as to what was happening and all that was going on. A few moments later, Caesar came down to the basement, his face as pale as a ghost. "What happened?" I asked. "The gunfire had ceased temporarily. The woman," Caesar stuttered, clearly freaked out by what had happened. "What about her?" I inquired further. "She's in the fucking wall," he replied. "She's in the what?" Like I think she flew through the kitchen window and now she's embedded in the fucking wall, Caesar said. As I tried to process those words, a final round of gunfire ripped through the night. The 7 of us hunkered down in the basement, listening to the frantic attempts of the last remaining dude to call for help over the radio. Then there was the sound of bones cracking and flesh tearing, followed by the man's petrifying screams, before everything went silent. The only sounds we could hear after that were the frantic barking of dogs from the neighborhood. There was just over an hour since that happened, and now it's almost completely silent. We're still hunkered down in the basement. All of us are terrified as hell, especially Monica and Isabel. Those two haven't stopped crying for the past hour. Not that I blame them. I'm nearly on the verge of tears myself. I've tried checking for updates on the current situation online, but strangely, nothing has come up, not even from our local news sources. Mind you, the town that I live in isn't a small one. It has a population of maybe 30,000, and yet nothing has come up. I wanted to call 911, but then I remembered the emergency services wouldn't be available until 8 a.m. So for now, here we stay. I'll try to provide any updates that I can, but my phone is low on battery, and I don't have my charger with me. But until then, wish us luck. We're gonna need it. I am a police officer in a small town. I'm starting to forget one of my most distressing calls. By PresidentMayor of r/no sleep. The call rang in at 7:42. I had just begun that day's closing operations, silently thanking God for another day of lackluster work. It's not every day that a missing child or murdered spouse happens, and to be quite frank, I like it to stay that way. Most days, like today, were calls of wrong numbers or the occasional missing dog. Today, Paul Jordan's boy, Kieran, called to tell us his cat ran away from home. When we arrived, a very apologetic Paul and tearful Kieran informed us that the cat had simply passed away the night before. As such, on a day like today, you don't expect the phone to change your life. I placed the cell to my ear and was greeted by an unfamiliar voice. Hello? It stated barely audible. Sheriff's office, what can I do for you? I responded, placing a cigarette in my mouth. Oh, I called the right number. The woman on the other end sounded 20 at the oldest. Her breath shook heavily, as though she had just run a mile and a half in the dead of winter. I could hardly make her words out from behind the heavy pattering of rain. She sounded quite surprised to get a hold of me, and I was quite surprised, if you don't know what I mean, to know who she was. Lawrence had a population of 1,200, and I'd spoken to just about all of them. I suppose you did, I said. What kind of work do you folks do? I paused, trying to remember if I truly had answered the phone the way I did. I suppose she took my silence as a confirmation of what she suspected, as she continued. I'm the new caretaker for Mr. and Mrs. Mulligan. You know, Tom and Esther. Right. Sorry. Mrs. Mulligan is in some sort of bad way, and we need her examined. I glanced at the clock. 7:45. Ma'am, I think you should call a doctor then. Lorraine is... I've already called Dr. Willows, she cut me off. She won't come back. This statement gave me pause. Dr. Lorraine Willows was a great friend of the Mulligans. Being that she was the only medical doctor in town, she likely knew more folks than I did. I knew that if Esther was in a bad spot, she'd want to help in any way possible. Right, I said finally. All right, what's going on? I'm not sure how to describe it. Mrs. Mulligan, she won't die. I paused again, unsure if I had heard her correctly. I had, though. Perhaps that this young woman had signed up to be a caretaker for one, not two. Maybe she didn't want to care for Esther, and it had slipped into her words somehow. Well, that's wonderful, I chuckled silently. I assure you, it's not, sir. Please, you need to come as quickly as you can. We need you. The phone call was disconnected before I could respond. I figured, with hesitation, that even if I didn't go on the business of the call, a wellness check was clearly in order. I called over my partner, John Lewis, and told him to put on his coat. "Where are we off to?" "My shift's over in 10, John whined. "Mine too. But we're going to the Mulligans." "Why's that?" he questioned, seeming less concerned with his punch card in his hand. "Wellness check," I said, opening the front door of the sheriff's office. "Their new caretaker is, John probed. "She's worried about Esther." I decided not to mention the fact that this new maid, whatever her name was, seemed suspiciously infuriated with the death of an old woman. John had grown in this town, unlike me, and he was surely even more concerned about the Mulligans than I was. As we arrived at the old home, it was in a horrible state of disrepair. The driveway was cracked and laden with all sorts of odd materials. Fire axes, a disconnected garden hose, an open bear trap, and more lay haphazardly around the front yard. One of the downstairs windows was busted wide open, covered by a blue tarp from the outside. The walkway to the front steps had been flooded by the heavy downpour that was still raging violently, and we couldn't see any lights on in the house. Whoever this caretaker was, sure the hell was doing a terrible job. "Christ!" John bellowed. "Put it down, Thomas." I swung my head in the direction that he was yelling. Outside in the pouring rain stood Thomas Mulligan. He was sitting half upright against a tree with a shotgun in his hands, pointed directly at John and I. "Mr. Mulligan," I too shouted, "we're here to check on Esther." "We don't want your help, creeper," he yelled, pointed the shotgun dead at me. Or you either, fatso." I glanced over at John, who seemed both upset that he wasn't recognized and that his childhood neighbor just insulted him. I placed my hands out and motioned for Thomas to put the shotgun down, as it was now pointed back at John. "Mr. Mulligan, I am Officer Grayson," I said slowly and firmly, "and this is Officer Lewis." "You know me, Thomas. It's me, John," my partner interjected, his voice quaking. At that, Mr. Mulligan lowered his shotgun, and the three of us let out a simultaneous sigh of relief. We approached the tree Mr. Mulligan was leaning against, and he raised his shotgun once more. "No, please," Mr. Mulligan yelled, more fearful than agitated now. "You don't want to. Mr. Mulligan's voice was cut off by the sound of the front door of the house swinging open with a loud crash. The silhouette of a frail young woman stepped out into the front porch. "Are you the officers I talked to?" The woman shouted as loud as she could, but was still hardly audible. "Yes, ma'am," I replied. Are you aware that Thomas is out here in the rain with a loaded weapon?" "I haven't been able to get to him to come back inside," she replied, approaching us weakly. I noticed she had a slight limp in her walk, and her right arm hung limply at her side. She was impossibly thin, with dinner plate-sized eyes and straight, thin brown hair. "Well, miss," John stated, passing glances between her and Mr. Mulligan. "Olivia Newman," she said quietly. "Well, Miss Newman, I'm not going to tell you how to do your job, but Thomas is your responsibility, and you need to get him inside." "Oh, don't blame her, Jack," Mr. Mulligan said hoarsely. I might be old, but I can still make my own decisions. I chose to come out here, and out here is where I'm staying." I kneeled down to meet Mr. Mulligan at eye level. He was bleeding, but I couldn't tell where, with all the rain. He was equally as emaciated as Miss Newman, like the pair hadn't eaten in weeks. His clothes were ill-fitted and torn, and he had a 1,000-yard stare like I'd never seen in another human being before. "What happened here, Mr. Mulligan?" I asked softly, his eyes drifting subtly away from me as he began to speak. "Olivia didn't tell you? It's... Oh, God. She won't die, kid." "Who won't die, Thomas?" Mr. Mulligan looked me dead in my eyes. He smiled and spoke uncharacteristically calm. "Son, promise me something," he whimpered, gazing back at the house. "If you send her to hell, tell her I said I was sorry the Lord couldn't take her where I'm going." With that, Thomas Mulligan, an 85-year-old man, went completely limp. His eyes had an unchanged soullessness, as though he died long ago. His smile faded, and the shotgun fell onto the driveway with a loud clatter. I stood up solemnly. Miss Newman began to scream, and John had the same exact stare Mr. Mulligan had just given me. "I'm really sorry, John," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've seen more than enough for tonight. Go home and hug your dad, man." John shrugged my hand off his shoulder. "Somebody has to call in the body," he said. And I didn't argue with him, as I still had to tend to Miss Newman and locate Mrs. Mulligan. I hung my head, sighed, and turned to Miss Newman. She was gently shaking Mr. Mulligan's body and sobbing uncontrollably. I placed my hand on her shoulder and gave her the warmest look I could muster at that moment. "Olivia," I said, "we should probably go check on Esther." Olivia said nothing. She turned back to Mr. Mulligan's body and did not move. I stood with her a moment, and then headed towards the front door. I still had a job to do. The inside of the house was even more disgusting than the outside. Piles of dirty clothes, spilled pill bottles, and rotting food covered the living room. The main stairs were missing half of the steps, and the banister was splintered in several directions. I held my breath as I carefully ascended the stairs, fearing more with each step that I would fall through them entirely. The upstairs was equally unpleasant. Peeling wallpaper and black mold all over the walls. The carpet was stained and matted, and a dog food bowl labeled Pommy was overflowing with canned meat. At the far end of the hall lit a single, strangely pristine bedroom door. A sense of dread hit me instantly as I approached the door, and I suddenly became quite aware that I was alone, and there was nobody else on the way. I knew I was about to see either an emaciated old woman who I knew was a personal friend, or a dead body. I knew that there was no way anyone would hear me scream over the rain and thunder outside. I knew that if Olivia made her way back inside, she would find me too. I knew John would have to go looking for me if I didn't come back. "Mrs. Mulligan?" I shouted. Nobody answered. "Esther, this is Officer Sam Grayson. I'm with the police. Is everything all right?" There was still no response. "Esther, I'm gonna come in, okay?" I twisted the doorknob hesitantly and pushed it open. As soon as I did, a small Yorkshire Terrier bolted out of the room. I watched him run down the stairs and out of the house like he hadn't left that room his whole life. He was well-groomed, fit, and generally looked more cared for than either of the human residents I had met. Inside the room, there was a single wooden chair on the side, directly in the middle. An empty noose hung from the ceiling. As I shone my flashlight in the room, I realized it was completely tidy. There was no indication that it had been connected to the rest of the house as it lay empty. There was a small vase with healthy flowers in it. The bed was made and tucked. The television was softly broadcasting the news. "Oh my! Hello, officer!" I swung around quickly as I could. Behind me in the doorway stood Esther Mulligan. She was as I remembered her, short, well-fed, and with a sweet glow around her. She gave me a comforting smile and walked past me with a large basket of dirty, mildewy clothes. "I heard about my dear Thomas," she said, almost giggling. "Shame he didn't come back in the house." She began folding the clothes and did not look at me. She either didn't notice or didn't care that the clothes were completely unsalvageable. "You did, though, didn't you?" She smiled, gesturing for me to sit next to her on the edge of the bed. I approached slowly, picking up the turned-over chair in the middle of the room. "Oh, that was a fun one," she said cheerfully, pointing at the noose. "Tried to hang myself. Doesn't feel nearly as uncomfortable as you'd think. With the right kind of rope, naturally." I cautiously sat down beside her, opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. "You know," she said, "I heard little Jack was an officer now. Is he downstairs?" No, ma'am," I managed to squeak out. "Ah, well, beggars can't be choosers, can they?" She placed a wrinkly, shaking hand on my thigh. "Olivia wasn't my first choice either. Mind you, we've gone through a lot of caretakers these past few months. You, though." Esther looked me up and down and pointed towards my gun holster. "I won't say we haven't tried it," she remarked, "but would you humor me?" I placed my hand on my gun, having every intention of it staying holstered. I shook my head slowly, unsure of the words that should come out of my mouth. "Ah, well, anyway," Esther said sadly, "I'd say you were free to leave, but Thomas and Olivia didn't fare so well, did they?" She stood up slowly, motioning for me to follow her. Against my better judgment, I kept a reasonable distance and followed her. She led me carefully around piles of food, trash, and laundry until we landed at the front door. "Quickly now, before it closes again," she remarked, stepping outside of the house as soon as I had joined her back onto the front porch. Door slammed closed on its own. Outside lay the bodies of Thomas Mulligan, Olivia Newman, and that little dog. The dog was now an unkempt and skinny, just like the two corpses, like it had rotted away as soon as it crossed the threshold of the front door. John was noticeably absent. The car was still there, but had nobody inside of it. "Little time to waste," Esther said, stepping over the little Yorkie. She stood in the middle of the driveway and held her arms out to her sides. "Try to see if you can do what they couldn't, Officer Grayson." I had no idea what she meant by that. My focus was clear on the bodies outside. When did Olivia pass? How did the dog die? What the hell was going on? Where the hell was John? I'm not sure how to describe what happened next, but one moment I was focused solely on the bodies of the deceased, and the next I had my gun in my hands and a bullet in the old lady. It was as if she had completely removed my free will, like she wanted her ending to go exactly as she planned and didn't want me mulling it over for too long. Esther laid on the grass, emaciated and unwashed, with a bullet in her head. Just as I had started to approach her, I felt a sharp pain in my left shoulder. I grabbed my shoulder and fell to the ground. As soon as I hit the floor, the rain had stopped. I was bleeding heavily, and John was standing over me. The bodies of the Mulligans laid across the yard, fully healthy, fully washed, fully lifelike. John was screaming at me, but I couldn't figure out what he was trying to tell me. Something about whether I had gone insane, what the hell I was thinking, why the hell I would harm that old woman. I tried to tell him she wanted me to, that I had no choice, but he wouldn't listen to me. Just as he was getting ready to put me into custody, the house began to shake. The entire building creaked and whirled for 30 seconds. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The building was back to normal, as though nobody had ever been inside of it. One by one, the Mulligans began to sit up, brush off their clothes, and head back inside. "Thanks for trying, officers," Olivia said sadly. "We'll probably see you again in a few weeks. Mrs. Mulligan just can't help it." And with that, she closed the front door and locked it. John quit the force a week after that call. They never did call again, at least not that I was ever made aware of. As far as I knew, life went back to normal for everybody but John and I. We agreed it would be best not to mention it to anyone about what happened. We didn't want anyone to go through what we had. I had all but completely repressed this memory over the last few years, but last week I was called back to the house. The entire building had burst into flames, with the 3 of the inhabitants presumed dead. I didn't register that it was the same house where it all happened until when looking for the deceased, I found a partially melted dog bowl labeled Pommy. No bodies were ever recovered from that house. It sits empty now, ready to be demolished. There was no family that ever claimed the property, and nobody ever reported anybody named Olivia Newman living in the home at all. As far as anyone can recall, the Mulligans lived alone, without the need for a caretaker. Even John is starting to forget the details of that night, and I'm afraid that I will too. I'm writing this down in case someone, anyone, has any information on Olivia Newman or the fire in Lawrence, Washington. If you know anything, please contact me. I might not remember this story soon, so please be timely as possible.